Thanks. Good afternoon. I'm David Lamb, Director of Art Management at Riot Games, also co-chair of the advisory board for XDS. Thanks for coming and good afternoon. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Just a reminder regarding under your badge, there's a couple cool things under there. One is the Diamond Scavenger Hunt. And so there are stations all over. There's instructions on the back on what you need to do. You need to collect them. You have a possible opportunity of getting an award at the awards ceremony on Friday. So don't forget about that. And lastly, there's a bunch of tickets. So for coffee and treats and all that sort of stuff, you're supposed to use these things and utilize them. And from what I was told, it's basically day 1, day 2, day 3, if you can see that. All right? So let's get underway here and introduce our speaker. So once a rifleman for the Canadian Armed Forces, Nigel Franks has had a lengthy 23-year career in tech, media, and software development. Currently, Nigel is studio director of production at Snowden Studios in Ottawa, Canada, a division of Keyword Studios. I've had the pleasure of introducing Nigel now, but I'm also a former client. So Nigel and I worked together in forming a partnership for Microsoft, a partnership we are proud to say that is healthy and growing to this day. Nigel is a smart, astute, and is an expert in the field of project management, building healthy teams, studio strategy, and coaching others towards success. So this is all before him even getting his MBA, which he did recently. So he's even smarter now. I've learned a lot working with Nigel, and I'm sure you will learn a lot today from his insightful presentation, Scaling a Studio, Why Growing a Studio and Innovation Are Harder Than They Should Be. Please give a warm welcome to Nigel Franks.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I really don't know how I can follow that, but I'll try and have something that's of value to everybody here. It is a tremendous honor to be here speaking with so many compatriots in the games industry, especially after 3 years of none of us being able to go anywhere. So it's the first really big trip for a lot of us, I think, and it's really great to be here as well. One thing David mentioned, I just finished some school. I just spent also 3 years listening to people talk and be talking heads in a classroom, and I'd rather not have that kind of presentation, so I like to be as interactive as possible. We've got a microphone that can go along, so when you see some material that you'd like to ask some questions on, please feel free, and we'll have the opportunity to have some information going back and forth, because this is an interactive thing. We all learn from each other. It's just the kind of situation where we're here learning from everybody here at XDS, which is awesome. So without any further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about scaling studios and how fun and challenging that can be, and some of the great things that happen along the way, and some things to keep an eye out for, because I know a lot of us here are in smaller studios or mid-sized studios and have the opportunity that we want to be growing a studio from one level to the next. And I'd rather pass on some of the information that we learned along the way with Snowden Studios and some of the other information that I've learned along the way in about 27 years of scaling different software development companies. So, a couple things we're going to be talking about. I'm not going to read all this down. I think you can all see that fairly enough. But a few things just before we begin. Just please, as with everybody, just keep the mobiles on silent. And also, at the end of the session, please review it, because otherwise I have to stay in this horribly not so nice city where I used to live. So I'm going to start because everybody at the studio tells me, Nigel, you tell too many stories, so I have to start with that. Anybody recognize this? Far Side, 1990? I actually remember the day that I read this in the newspaper in 1990, and this was pre the huge boom in video games that we've had. And it's kind of interesting because basically what they're saying is that these parents are idiots, because they're looking ahead to the jobs in 2005, imagining that letting their kid play these games is going to erupt with these amazing jobs for the child, right? And so the irony behind all this is that, take a look at these numbers. In 2005, when I had the opportunity to work with one of the greatest racing teams at the time in working on Need for Speed, those salaries actually matched the kind of salaries that we had at the time for the people that we were trying to hire into the studio. And some of those so the salaries, even for me as a manager, were higher than mine. And that's one of the things you have to get used to, is that when you're working in a large studio, sometimes that's going to happen. So I like to show all this because it shows how often things change for us in our industry and how rapidly it's growing. And that irony is something that it's just definitely not lost on me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my background, mostly about all the cool things that happen when we're scaling studios. So way back when, I got to march around and do things and wear a pretty uniform. And if there was one overriding theme when I was putting all this together, when it came down to scaling a studio, the theme is surprises. So for example, I showed this inside the company I work for, Snowden Studios, an extension of Keyword Studios. And I saw the chat going by in Teams and somebody said, "Nice picture of the drill instructors course parade in 1987, Franks." And I was like, how would anybody know that? And he was actually somebody who was there at the time who actually works in Keywords Montreal, which I thought was kind of cool. That led to me going into, from the cadets, going into the infantry, jumping out of helicopters and dodging and catching bullets, that kind of thing, which really doesn't give you all that background that you need for software development, but I somehow found a way in. So this was my first software company back in 1996. But I ended up going back and forth between Vancouver and Ottawa at the time. We ended up opening up a small office here in Vancouver, and I just thought, this is amazing, I'm never going to leave. The city is amazing, making huge proclamations like, obviously I'm never going to leave, and I left a couple of years later after that. So the other proclamation was like, I'll never see inside this magic castle on the hill up on Sanderson Way. And of course I learned as well that I actually did get to look inside that as well. I'll tell you a little bit about that. So over that time, after that I ended up coming back to my hometown of Ottawa, adoptive hometown because I'm an immigrant here in the country. And now here I am with Snowden Studios for the last 3.5 years, and it's been absolutely fantastic. Great group of people. And what's really interesting about this is that I'm working with such a smart group of people in the studio that's always encouraging me to up my game. That's pretty important for me. So for the people that are interested in here in being and learning about scaling, there's 2 different ways you can go about doing this, and there's 2 different types of people that this talk could be for. We have one overriding principle, and we started thinking about this as a studio as to how we ended up defining all this, what are our values. The most interesting thing for us was that one overriding principle for how we built the studio is that value is people first. So if you agree with that, that's great. This talk is for you. There's another way of looking at it. First off, anybody recognize what this is? No fellow sci-fi nerds in here like me? No guesses? It's kind of written in the corner in this other picture down here. No? This is a copy of The Rules of Acquisition from these guys, from 25-year-old sci-fi. So essentially, it's a series of rules that dictate how one particular society works in Star Trek, which is amazing. And it's all about greed and acquisition of wealth. And this is the kind of rules that you see inside the rules of acquisition, including rule number 211, which I thought was interesting. 211 was my old squadron number. I kind of laughed at that. Rule 109 is probably my favorite one. Dignity in an empty sack is worth the sack. So forget your dignity, just get their money. So if that's how you operate, that's not what this kind of talk is for. But throughout my period in working in the games industry, I've had the opportunity to work at some great studios building some of these titles here. And each one of these had to do with scaling a team from 5 to 50 to 75 to 100. And the beauty about this is, being here in Vancouver, there's some people in this room that helped and were part of this whole organization as we started putting all these together, which is great. I've bumped into people already that have worked on 2 of these titles here, a 3rd one over here. I'm working with a couple of them right now. Just bumped into my old friend Chris, who helped me work with that Marvel title. And basically, my perspective on this is, fantastic, I'm doing this amazing job and I can do these amazing things, don't screw this up. So also throughout that period, I've had the opportunity to work on a whole pile of different video apps. So each one of these required anywhere from a team of 5 to 150 from studios that started off very small and then grew into 200 and 300 organizations. Now, I'm not saying all this because it's like, oh, glory me, look at all the stuff I've done. It's like, no, these are like really big challenges where we come together as a group of people, and there's no one person that can solve this problem. It's a group thing where we figure out exactly how big we need to be. And some of these names are pretty big, and if you screw them up, people will remember, right? Movies Anywhere has now actually been translated into something called Disney+. Show Me for the Canadians here no longer exists, which is really unfortunate because it was kind of cool that we had something like that. Twitch obviously is still kicking around. We did the PS4 version of that, NFL, etc. Well, the whole point of that is that with all of this, there are different ways of looking at how teams grow and different problems that come along with that. So this is what the headcount of each one of those organizations look like roughly from the time that I've been working in software back in 1994 to present day. So the blue column here is where the headcount started and where it ended up, all the way up to Snowden Studios. So the best thing about this is the learning aspect, personally for me, and what we ended up learning about how this works. So with this one, real simple, how to burn through somebody else's venture capital money and not have a solid exit. That is a hard lesson to learn. It's one you have to pick yourself up off the ground and learn from again. And I tried doing that with consulting and had a small exit from that, which is kind of cool. I had a great experience with Next Level Games, and the personal learning there was, what is the value of a studio head who already has an MBA and knows how to get a bucket of money and manage that bucket of money going forward? And that was really key for the success of that particular studio, as well as another studio in town that ended up getting acquired by EA called Black Box Games. Both of those studio heads knew each other from the same MBA class. And that was teaching me, it's like, maybe I should go to school at some point. And so for about 20 years, I was thinking that's something I wanted to do. Throughout my time working with EA, I learned about scaling for a publisher. And suddenly when there's a lot of cash available, that really changes the world as to how you can scale very quickly. For example, that Marvel project was a co-development project with another studio in California, and we realized that we needed to be able to scale up our team here. We basically went from 6 to about 35, if I remember correctly, or 35 or 40, literally overnight. And that has a whole series of problems that go along with that as well, and benefits too. This other one, a really interesting company, the one that's doing all the TV apps, had a 70 million exit. They were purchased by Warner. I'm okay with not being part of that because there were just basically that company was so far in debt at that particular time that there was a very few amount of people that could profit from it. And then finally, this last bit of scaling experience that I've had was I got a lot to learn and it's time to go back to school. So it's really interesting for me in that at this point, it was just perfect from a pandemic standpoint. I can do all that, get some additional learning from that, but essentially change management needed a lot of improvement along with a couple of other skills as well. So enough about that. One thing that's really interesting here are the common threads throughout all of this. And this is the one that really surprised me, that through all of this, you'd think that if you have the ability to have a great P&L throughout the whole aspect of this, it's going to be great. But all those assumptions I found out were wrong. So they're only the very basic beginning and start of essentially starting to scale the studio. This one was probably the one that's the most important, and that the actual studio culture that you have is way more important than just the financial acumen of growing a studio, because it's really going to be defining how you act, how you grow. And I was having this conversation just before lunch, I think, with somebody. It was really important to hear that it's like, yeah, some studios do this, they grow rapidly overnight with a whole pile of juniors, and the seniors aren't happy with the culture anymore, and they leave. And what good is that? Force of will, cult of personality. Anybody remember the movie, and again I'm dating myself, startup.com? It's a great movie about startups in the internet era, and that was all about the cult of personality getting 60 million on a napkin and then blowing through that as quickly as possible over the span of a couple of years, not having anything left over. Without the knowledge, it's going to be basically hurting you. Never let yourself get complacent. Competition is good. And this is the one, the biggest learning for me, if I can impose on anybody to walk away from this, is understand what change management actually is, because a lack of expertise in change management is really going to hurt you if you're not familiar with that. And after talking to people who did have those MBAs and started studios, that basically it can really help in some cases. And I'm not saying this promoting it by any stretch of the imagination. It's just like, this is what I thought I needed to be able to help me go back and be able to help scale a studio. But there are pluses and minuses, right? Because basically, you try to do that while you're building a studio in school. This is where you get to see my artwork. This is me before the MBA, and this is me after the MBA, right? So it took a little bit while for me to recover from that. I think I'm about halfway in between there right now. It's kind of cool. Right, so here's the thing. Scaling is hard. It has implications. It's hard on the people going through it. There are a lot of questions that happen, so here's why you shouldn't do it. This was the growth curve that we had over the last few years. If you take a look at 2010, 2011, it's pretty steady up until the Keywords acquisition in 2018. And then it's been pretty high upward since then, which is kind of neat. And this is actually out of date. So we're probably about 9 months out from this last count. I think we're closer to the 188 mark as of today. And it's continuing. So a couple of reasons why you shouldn't. Any guesses why you shouldn't scale? Nobody? Bueller?
It's expensive.
I heard it's expensive. Any other reasons why you shouldn't scale?
Mental fatigue.
Mental fatigue, that's a good one, yeah. I heard productivity, sorry?
It breaks your culture.
It breaks your culture, absolutely, it can do that. So I'm going to take some advice from somebody way smarter than me that's got a startup in Toronto. Her name is Catherine Homewood, and she's the CEO of SheerTex, completely different business than technology. But essentially, everything breaks. And I don't mean a couple of things here and there. I mean everything. Everything breaks. Here's the quote that comes from Catherine in the Globe and Mail's report on business. I believe it's a report of the top 100 companies in Canada. Essentially that everything, when you try to scale by 5%, everything breaks internally, and they're trying to grow by 100% or more every year. Everything's broken all the time. And this is common with, a lot of us have seen this in studios ourselves, right? So everything can just start falling apart if you're not preparing for it. So for us, our strategy is to grow, and I don't mean growing by just looking at the P&L, but we want to have a healthy game development culture in the city of Ottawa, because there never really has been one. There have been a couple of things that started here and there. And we want to make sure that we've got a healthy growing studio in the Ottawa region. That is our strategy. That's how we're doing it. However, we had a lot of stuff bust in the last couple of years. The actual plan itself, it's so funny because you get attached to a plan and it's yours and you built it and like all these things you're going to be doing, and the plan just falls apart. So that thing ended up falling apart. And I'll talk about the startup J-curve and exponential organizations and a couple of things to be aware of there. Our promotion processes broke. There are some people in this room that were with us as we were going through this and going, how did this actually fall apart into this situation? And it's because you can plan for almost everything, and then there's a whole new series of items that are going to come along and surprise you. We had new problems with no one to staff them. 10 years ago, who heard the terms DEI and ESG in the same frequency that we're hearing them today? And we're running up into this now with people saying, well, I'd love to work for your company, but what's your plan on DEI and ESG? And it's like, well, we don't have somebody dedicated to running that right now. So we have to basically ride on some of the initiatives coming out of the Keywords group, which we're really happy about, but something that we have to put some focus on because that's super important to us. Individually, we all agree with the principles behind diversity, equity, inclusion, environmental, social governance, but it's a lot of work to have somebody dedicated working on these particular items. One of the biggest ones, overloaded managers, right? Suddenly, the most trusted people in an organization are always those that are directly managing the majority of people, right? And if they get overloaded, then everything starts to crumble. This was one that surprised us as well. The difficult salary discussions after everybody gets bumped up 15 to 18% and we define new levels and somebody says, well, I don't exactly fit in this new level anymore. And the end result is I'm getting a demotion of 0.06 of a level. Why is this happening? And we're like, you just got a really big raise. How is this an issue, right? So these are the kind of things we didn't think about. Well, we should have because we work with a pile of mathematicians, but learning, humbling experiences. Right, so about this and the things that broke, plans have to adapt. I'm no expert on this. The fellow that wrote this book, Howard Love, basically it's called The Startup J-Curve, and basically talks about startup companies and how they need to change. And if you get so attached to your idea, you're almost guaranteed to fail, because his idea was that after 17 startups, you start with an idea, you morph it down at the bottom of that J, and then as you start releasing it into the wild, you morph it even more, and then you go up to that level of scaling. So that's one thing to be aware of there. The other thing is that innovation and growth will get attacked from within. This will happen in almost every single case. Any idea why? I've heard fear of change, and sorry, Tina? Resistance to change. There's a really interesting concept of this called homeostasis in the human body, right? It keeps us all like temperature regulated, energy levels regulated, when you need to sleep, when all of your hormones are operating at a certain level. Organizations are exactly the same. So I'm no expert on this part. This guy, Salim Ismail, did a really good job. There's about a 45-minute YouTube that I really recommend that people watching. I guarantee you'll get something out of it. But he wrote this book called Exponential Organizations. Fantastic piece of literature. And what he's talking about here is that companies, organizations just can't innovate. They just cannot do it. I just picked up a book called Investing in the Apocalypse. It's really fun. It's like a catchy title. It's like, oh, apocalypse. It's talking about pandemics, and this book was written 10 years ago. I was like, kind of weird. But it basically said if a company's not innovating, it is by definition dying. So I was like, yeah, that's the way I've always thought about it. But I had people come back and challenge me on this. Why are we growing? Why are we innovating? Interesting about this is that, take a look at Yahoo. They were 10 years old. They couldn't innovate. And they called this guy in to say, what do we need to do? And essentially, the idea behind coming up with an innovation group is that you have to split out a group of people that are innovating from the main core line of the business, let them do their thing in the corner, and let that innovation be brought back into the organization. Otherwise, people are going to be resisting it. So again, human beings, or organizations like human bodies, they basically maintain that level of homeostasis. And basically that resistance to change ends up acting like those antibodies attacking it, and then think of like, oh yeah, building muscle in Plato's cave allegory. I'm going back to my philosophical roots here. When you build muscle, it tears, right? And it hurts to come back together, but the muscle comes out bigger and stronger. That's the whole point behind resistance training. Plato's cave allegory is basically that everybody's in the cave looking at the back of like all the shadows on the wall. Nobody wants to leave, right? As soon as somebody walks out and says, okay, well, that's not reality, and they see the light behind you, and they're like, take a look at this fantastic light back here, and there's a huge meadow out there with different things, and you want to go back into the cave and tell people, that's not reality, what's sitting in front of the cave here? And everyone's like, no, forget it, it's comfortable here. Don't go show us what these great things are in the meadow, we're happy in this cave. Exactly what Salim Ismail talks about in exponential organizations. All right, so moving along. Our plan, things that changed, right? So we had all these great things that we're doing over a 5-year span, and we're somewhere over here, and we expect it to be a little bit further to the right on this curve. But we've learned a bunch of things, and we want to make sure that we're slowing things down. This is essentially one copy of our plan with just the actual tasks taken out with like growth tasks slotted in. But we have a lot of ambitions for how we want to be moving our studio forward. So basically, don't do it. It sucks. That's my advice. You will lose all your friends. Absolutely everything is going to break. You'll be hated. You'll get angry emails at 9 o'clock at night. Everything's totally fine. We don't need to change. But just in case it's not, here's something to be aware of and why you do need to scale. So first thing, again, I'm getting back to some of the questions I got from people on the floor saying, why are we doing this? And I've been doing this for so long that it didn't quite register. I kind of did like, brain aneurysm going off, going, why do I have to answer this question? And again, that was my own lack of understanding what everybody was going through, because it gets so attached to this idea that this is how we're going to be growing. So I actually asked my profs at school when I was going through my MBA program over the last 3 years and said, how do you answer this question as to why you scale? And they said, it's real simple. These are the things you have to be aware of. Somebody is always coming after you. And for me, that was just like, what? Nah, we're fine. But no, somebody's always coming after your market. They're coming after the product that you're making. They're coming after the service that you're offering. Someone's always coming after you. Someone's always coming after your people. And one way that you can protect that is to scale so you have more opportunities for people to be able to enjoy the work that they're doing in the place where you're working with them. We've seen this right now. Inflation is the really big thing on the news. We've all seen prices go up. I have a lot of feeling for all of our compatriots in Europe right now, watching their energy prices go through the roof. But just through inflation alone, like in a normal year, if you're staying the same, you're by definition dying as a business. So employees themselves, they also need growth, right? We all do. I mean, me as an employee, I needed that. Every employee that we work with at Snowden Studios needs that. So the tail end of this is they either get it with you or ... They're going to get it someplace else, right? So anybody else that offers that's also in a path of growth is going to be able to basically steal the people that you need to help you maintain your business, right? So why do people leave a company? That's a question for everybody here. What do you think?
Better pay.
Better pay? That's about number 4 down the list, but that's a good one. Company culture is probably like tied with like 2 and 3. probably also tied at 2. No, career growth and opportunities, probably tied at number 2 and 3. So, poor management is probably number 1. Poor management indeed. I don't know about you, but the numbers themselves actually stated that the majority of people will leave a bad manager and a toxic culture first before anything else. Nobody ever leaves a job. They leave a manager, right? They leave a culture where they can't grow. There are always exceptions to the rule. But suddenly, if somebody has the opportunity for a better manager, getting away from a toxic one or one that doesn't help them grow, somebody has the opportunity to do some really cool stuff they haven't had the chance to do before, and bonus, they'll do it for another 25% in pay, it's a done deal, right? But it's those other 2 things, or other 2 or 3 things when it comes down to toxic culture or bad management that basically have people moving on. Right. Another reason that you want to start taking a look at scaling is crisis management. I'm going to talk about this one because this is actually kind of important. Anybody familiar with the crisis curve, how it works? This is actually kind of cool. I was going to school, I learned stuff. So this is about strategic performance of an organization. And we have just seen the example of this, perfect example throughout all of this throughout the last 3 years of the pandemic. Your strategic performance is on the left-hand axis over time. Kind of neat. So performance goes up or down depending on what you do and where you are. The crisis curve says if you get ready for all this and you anticipate change, your performance will go up. If you anticipate as many crises as you possibly can and you're prepared for it, your performance will continue to go up. Who could anticipate the pandemic? We sure as heck didn't. Did anybody here? Probably not. What's really interesting is at reactive change, where we all caught up, is exactly what happens in crisis management. So suddenly we were all working from home, where before publishers said there's no way anybody can work with any of our IP off of the particular site behind a locked door with everything else that's going on. We figured that out. But there was a dip in performance when you start taking a look at quality of code, quality of relationships, lines of code written, amount of things tested, translated, put together. We did have that dip before it started coming back up again and we normalized. But this is the hard part. If you're just stuck in crisis change, you're all the way down here. Take a look at any of the large oil companies that have to do with a massive environmental disaster. Suddenly everything drops to the floor because they're not anticipating. They're getting to this point at the crisis change bit. And the paradox here is that this is the hardest place to fix. The easiest bit to fix is at the beginning. So, how you shouldn't do it. A couple of things to bear in mind here. Going back to school for a couple of years and getting some education for probably the first time in my life. I think last time I'd actually completed a full year of school was 14 years old before I went back to school now. We heard all these really great terms, weighted average cost of capital, IRR, all these really interesting things that are just basically it's like, oh, businessy terms. These things may work for game development, but they typically don't because we're in a very different kind of industry with very high profit margins depending how we're managed, right? NPV and DR are probably the 2 biggest things they teach you at business school. Like, you have to know what this is at all times. I'm like, well, here's how we make money. And they said, no, I don't think that works, Nigel. Like, I don't think you know how business actually works. It's like, well, here's how we make money, guys. What do you guys say to that? It's like, well, I don't think you understand the textbook very well. So this is a very frequent thing where I had to explain how the games industry revenue model worked to my profs. And this was the initial result that I got back from them. And they'd say, well, how does that really work? How much money do you actually make as a business? And this was the result. So what does that actually mean for all of us here? The key takeaways for this is that all that modeling, you should do some of it. If you have the familiarity with it, that's great. You can have business people do that. Do your modeling out for 5 years. But we are not making these massive capital expenditures, right? So we're basically doing operational expenditures, not CapEx. So the standard financial analysis models don't always work. The other key takeaway from this is that you could barrel ahead on willpower and you will fail. So there has to be some background or some balance between those two, between the capital investment as well as, or capital terms, as well as the vision for where you want to go. But if you're only barreling ahead on willpower, you're almost guaranteed to fail. The most important thing that I took away from this is like, do not ignore the people that are closest to all the change that are saying, this really hurts and we have to do things differently. And while we listened to that, we didn't understand it fully until we started deciding that we're going to be changing how things actually go. So they'll tell you about those concerns about the crisis curve. So here are a couple things about how to go about it. These are surprises that we found from input from our teams. I didn't write all this up. This is actually like copied and pasted from several emails and text messages from managers throughout the studio. This is actual data that we said, you really got to change the way things are going with our change management. This bottom one was the one that surprised the most out of me. It was just like, how about you grow and stabilize, grow and stabilize? And I'm like, boy, that is remarkably smart. Why don't we do that instead of going on this straight curve as everything's breaking? That's kind of the phase that we're in right now. One thing about strategy versus execution itself, strategy, being a cool planner. Like you're a general with a cigar in their mouth going, yeah, I'll strategize about all this. That is so easy. That is basically putting a plan on paper and saying, this is what we're going to do in the next couple of years. It's nothing. The actual hard part where most people fail is the execution. There is no risk in making those plans on paper. One thing that I was talking to a bunch of people at Develop Brighton about this, and they agreed that the actual biggest problem about scaling as your studio starts to grow is not having the right people in these roles before you start to do that, whether it's proper PMs, HR, tech management, art management, financial management. These are the places that are going to end up burning you if you don't have them in place before you end up scaling and growing. The other thing, and I did mention this early on, was about change management. And I say, or what we're starting to do now, because we're just at the beginning of starting to do this ourselves properly. And this is where we had our single biggest areas of learning. I think that's a polite way of saying, it didn't go so good, which is change management. And this is basically a change management strategy for how it should be working across any organization that's looking to scale and communicate a change. First thing is identifying it, putting the details together, identifying what your approach is going to be, implementing it, and monitoring it. Are there any other project managers in here? Right. Looks a lot like PM, CM, and basically going through a pattern of identifying, going through that entire process, measuring it, establishing your KPIs, and going on from there. So there's a lot of great details in here. Change management in and of itself is a science. Really read up on it. Paul Cotter wrote a great book called Managing Change, I believe it is, and he's got 3 or 4 others as well. Managing Change is probably one of the best books that you can pick up if you're looking to change an organization over time. And this one's going to give you a lot of insight over what are the mistakes you should be avoiding before you start doing this. Ironically, as we started this process, one of the senior producers came to me and said, hey, Nigel, read this book on change management. And I said, hey, dude, I don't have time for this. Like, I'm supposed to be managing all this other stuff. Year 2 of the MBA, my prof says, here's this book on change management. It's exactly the same book that this particular producer gave me. So that was a very big, humbling, head-bowing experience. But basically, again, it gets back to this point about the people that are actually making this change. The most trusted people in any organization are the ones closest to managing individuals on the floor. So that's where you need to focus the communication about change management and get all the input as to what's going right and what is not. For us, that's producers, leads from art, technical, et cetera, and because they're managing everybody day to day on the floor, hearing what these concerns are and making sure that we're not basically stepping on our toes when it comes down to implementing this change. So again, we're working on this. One thing that's really interesting that came out of studying in school was a Diamond D analysis. So change management, step 1, take a look at the actual growth strategy you're putting together. These are nice, pretty colors, but they call it the Diamond E because of the diamond on the left and the E for environment. And it's basically, there's an acronym for management preferences, organizational capabilities, resources, strategy, and environment. And so I map all these things out. Use your tool to figure out how you're going to grow. These are some of the things that are important to us under each one of these areas. And again, this was actually, I took this out of one of my school assignments because it was actually very apropos to what we're doing with our studio growth. And what was really interesting was that one of my profs said, this is great, but I'm calling you on your BS. Because everything you've been telling me for the last year and a half is all about the amazing culture of the studio that you're working with. And I don't see that on any of these particular items here. And again, it was one of those, forehead slapping moments going, yeah, totally right. We have to focus on maintaining that before we take a look at any of these other things that are important for us for growth. And it was actually this assignment where she said that. One thing that's really interesting, the personal readiness standpoint, this is basically a change agenda for how that works. You have your starting conditions, your guidelines for actions, plan for actions. Please feel free to take all this. This is not me, right? This is Van den Bosch, a couple of the other references I'll have and some other slides in here as well. But all this, people have done all this work for you, right? You can just go and take these and start mapping them to all the things you have to be aware of. And all of this should literally be like an afternoon's worth of work to identify these particular items, and then the hard part comes, which is communicating that change through a change management strategy. Personal readiness is something you shouldn't forget, though, because when you start doing this with multiple things on the go, something's going to be falling off, whether it's impacts to your health or stress and things of that nature. So for me, implementing this plan plus an MBA workload is significant was the way of saying, it's almost impossible for me to do this without getting a heart attack. So that's one thing you have to be aware of. KPIs is another big thing. Make sure that if you've got the same kind of values that we share, like people first, then your KPIs need to be able to reflect that. It can't just be the straight numbers of what you're doing with profit, et cetera. So one of ours is measuring workforce satisfaction. How happy are people with all the changes that are coming? You can basically measure retention, revenue, and growth. What's the really big KPI everyone's using these days? Net Promoter Score, right? Everyone's heard it? No? Yes? No? NPS? NPS is kind of interesting. I remember talking to my marketing prof about that, and he was just like spitting and he got so mad. He says, I hate NPS. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, because it's one-dimensional. It only covers one particular thing. So use it, but use it in conjunction with other things as well, and just make sure that they end up passing the sniff test for scientific validity and reliability. So these are the things that all your KPIs have to pass that bar for. Now, I'm going to talk about the 4 key pillars of successful growth in the last couple of minutes that I have here. Again, this is not me. I put the Globe and Mail logo up there because this came out of the May issue of Report on Business, because they took the top 100 managed companies in Canada, and their criteria was there was a Canadian company headquartered here, and basically applied a couple of key pillars that were really important, and this is something I'd really like to stress. First off, you have to have a plan. Strategy's pillar number 1, right? Have a formal methodology in place for that. Making sure that you've got the right stakeholders that are involved and the communications reflecting that. Number 2, like this is well beyond any of the financial stuff, right? The plan first, culture next, making sure you've got this culture that supports that and you're promoting that culture from within as to what that actually looks like. Actively developing people and the leadership team. Super important. For us, I like to stress all this, that culture, you can talk about culture all the time. For me and for all of us, that's not going like, rah, 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 we're the greatest studio ever, and then everybody gets ground into the dirt with overtime. That's not how we operate. For us, it's like a fancy word of saying how we act, how we talk. Do the things that we're actually doing match what we said we're going to be doing, which is the basis of our culture and integrity. Capabilities and innovation, pillar number 3. That's one's pretty straightforward. And then governance and financials, where a lot of people do fall down or just put all their stress there. Again, this is not me, this is not Nigel talking about this. This is the Globe and Mail with their top 100 best managed companies. And the thing I have to admit is like, we're still working on all of these. We don't have this nailed yet, right? This is just now taking a look at all of this and saying, all right, we know what our next steps are for how we're going to be implementing our next stage of growth. Hence the growth, stabilize, growth, stabilize. That stabilization point in here for us is making sure we've got all this right and nailed before we get to that next stage. Because we have pretty big, ambitious plans. So growth itself is creative destruction. A lot of startup founders talk about creative destruction when it comes down to growth. Again, I really want to stress that planning is the easy part. Execution's tough. Use your tools. They're kind of neat. Like you can do a SWOT analysis or the reverse of that, which is TOES analysis, which is very popular these days. But you have to shift to change management as one of your keys and really understanding change management to do that successfully. I say read up on it like a crazy person because I strongly recommend doing that. There are so many different insights that are really going to help you along the way. Take a look at those 4 pillars: strategy, culture, capabilities, innovation, and governance. And then use the metrics that actually make sense for you, right? The ones that actually make sense for what your culture is that you're trying to maintain inside your organization. Now, with all of this, surprises can come at any time. This helps you to understand and minimize the impact those surprises will have in a really big way. So you've got a couple options, right? Decide to scale, decide not to scale. I strongly recommend for the growth of your business that you have those really big, audacious goals, because they are going to help you survive things like pandemics and other challenges that are coming along. I go back to these guys. Rule 9, opportunity plus instinct equals profit. You can be in the middle, the way that Aristotle said, the middle path is always the way, it's never in the extremes. We're in business. We're here to make cool games, do amazing creative things, but it's still a business. So we have to be aware of that. With that, I have to say, be bold, move forward, and do what Peter Drucker says, the best way in order to be able to predict the future is for you to create it. So thank you.
So questions in the audience, just to give you some instructions. This is Nerf safe, I guess you would call it.
Yeah, you can throw it.
Yeah, you can throw it. And so just if you ask a question, please catch it or don't dodge it. Also, please speak into the mic here so that we can catch it for the cameras, okay? There's a question here on the front. Ready? Oh, great.
Score.
Fail. Okay, is this working?
It sure is, yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned the importance of having managers in place before you grow your team, but how do you deal with having a lack of work to provide these managers before the growth actually happens?
So how do you deal with a lack of work for those managers in place before the growth happens?
Yeah, like if you're predictively hiring for these positions, but you don't necessarily have the work for them to do yet.
That's
in preparation for having like a solid structure before you grow.
That's a really excellent question. The best way to answer that is to have them part of the planning for growth, because they need to anticipate how big the HR team is going to be. So what does that look like? How kind of support do they need as an HR individual or as a financial individual? What does it look like if I need to be reporting on these particular areas? One of the big challenges that we ran into was definitely our producer/PM team. Right? So do we start hiring first to have more people in those positions, knowing that we're going to be getting more projects coming in? What do we do with them in the meantime? It's like, well, help us plan out what the next phase is going to be looking like, and then start putting some of that bench strength onto other projects when they can.
So kind of learn how to delegate the planning and incorporate them in that planning process.
Not just delegate, but make them part of the planning process itself, because they're going to see things that you don't all the time. All the time. And if you're so attached to that it's only you doing that, you might as well stop now because you've already failed. That's my very opinionated view. I think these things can only succeed when you've got a group of people coming together to finish off that plan.
Awesome, thanks.
Again, it's the J curve of the plan too, right? It's going to change. You've got this idea as to where it's going to go, and then it has that morphing bit at the bottom.
All right.
Hi.
Hi.
Good talk. So does your strategy work in the same way for if you're growing from 100 to 200 as it might do for us, which is 10 to 20? Is there a tipping point whereby a lot more of what you were talking about is more relevant, and whereas what we're doing at the moment is much smaller, but it still has we're still looking at 100% of growth, but it's just tiny as compared to what you're after?
No, there's absolutely no change, because I've done it for these 1 to 10, 1 to 30, 30 to 100, 100 to, I think the biggest one I've scaled is 300. So I'm a small business kind of guy, right? Haven't done it in these huge mega corporations unless it's like a team going up to 200, 250 inside of EA. But in every case, it's been literally all the same principles from 1 to 10, but you dial back the number of positions that you've got there. It might be 3 or 4 people that share some of those management positions that have to be taken care of. But if you don't do that, it's going to end up burning you, even with that group of 10. Does that make sense? Cool.
I have a question from the control booth, actually, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
I found your presentation amazing. On one of your slides, you mentioned holistic comp. What does that mean?
That's a holistic compensation. So the overall package and not just pay, because we know that if we were just looking at pay in the world that we're in today, sorry, that's an excellent question, by the way. It's the total compensation package for the individuals that are working with you in your organization. We know that there's a bare minimum of benefits that are required, but what does it actually look like from a compensationary position if your company is scaling? Does everybody gain as well with the opportunity financially as the company starts to grow? Money is important to a point, right? As we've all seen with inflation, money is way more important now than it was before. But especially with seniors, they're at a particular level from a salary standpoint that they're going to have a similar type of salary wherever they go. But what does the rest of the compensation package look like? It used to be just a matter of, okay, let's give another 25%, but what happens if suddenly we move to 5 weeks of vacation instead of 3? That's part of that holistic compensation package. And this is the kind of thing where you get the input from the teams as well as what your competition is doing. And that's better for everybody all around, because it doesn't matter where you go, what studio, where it is, if there's a much broader compensationary package that you could be putting in place, that raises the standards for everybody across the board. And for us, one of the biggest things is no crunch, right? So how many times have we sat there late at night, 3 o'clock in the morning, waiting for a build coming across and thinking, gee, I wish I could see my kids? There are different things that you can do that are part of the entire cultural and compensatory package that I think are considered part of that holistic compensation bit. Any other questions? Anybody totally disagree? Controversy is good.
Hello.
Hello.
I really like the presentation, and I'm hoping for a biased answer for this. I'd like to know what you, after growing snowed in at such an exponential rate, I think over the last few years, what was the thing that stands out to you as the most humbling experience that you were probably taught by somebody on your team? You mentioned listening to the team a lot. What's the one that sticks out to you the most?
The one? It was a series of humbling experiences the whole way through. And I first off, it's not me doing this. It was a group of us from management coming together throughout all of this. I'd say that the biggest thing is lack of understanding of change management and all the pieces that go along with that. So for me, it was being able to communicate the reason why we're doing this in the first place, because a lot of people are saying, it's fine the way it is. We love the way it is. I know all the people I work with. I know the place I'm coming to every day. Why do you want to change it? It's so good. And it's like, I don't have an answer for that. Like, business is to grow. And that for me was, again, that mind-blowing type of experience. And then after that came with the next series of questions of, why are you doing this all wrong? How come you didn't read this book? And what are all these other things? So there wasn't one particular experience. There's a wide variety of them, but the biggest thing was understanding change management and the fear that people genuinely have. Because for me, maybe I'm lacking a chemical in the brain. I'll go into like super high-speed things like running down mountains or going down, I don't know, the Lynn Canyon on inline skates. But for me, business is kind of the same idea. It's like this big thrill of like, all right, what are we going to be doing next? What are you doing next? And I don't want to lose sight of those things that are like the guardrails that are really important, because not everybody thinks the same way, and that doesn't make it wrong or doesn't make me better. But I didn't take into consideration a lot of those other perspectives. And when you start hearing about them, you're like, okay, all right, let me just explain again why this is really important, as opposed to really listening to what the fear and concern is behind that.
Right. Thanks.
There's a question behind you there.
Ready?
Hello. Whoa.
Hello.
Nice. Okay. I'm going to try and formulate myself here as efficiently as possible. It's something I'm struggling with our growth, and that's we have a pretty intense belief in culture at our studio. We're a creative services studio, and one of the things I've really built the studio on is this idea that we don't obsess about job titles. We obsess about making the individual as productive as possible. So we spend a lot of time looking at people's strengths and weaknesses and being as open and honest and nice about that and saying, hey, I think maybe your roles and responsibilities should be adjusted so that you're able to perform at your best as an individual, which is great. It works brilliantly. But we're growing the company. We're currently 18 people. We want to be 35 in about 18 months. And I wonder if that kind of custom approach to responsibilities is scalable. Like, do you need to turn people into cogs and have very specific job titles and roles and responsibilities that you now must feel this regardless of whether or not that matches your personality?
Wow, what a great perspective and what a great question. If it ever gets to the point where you have to get to the point where people are being cogs and have to have these particular names, that doesn't sound like success to me, right? So is it scalable? Absolutely, until it's not. And basically, until you don't have the support structures in place to be able to make sure that people can do the best work, these things will change over time. Like, I can guarantee it. Certain companies had a lot of stress on having no titles whatsoever. Those companies I worked with scaling, some of them had no titles, and they wanted to keep it that way until they got to like 50 people, and they realized, okay, we kind of do need a head of development over here. And that was the only title that came in one particular case. Other companies didn't have any of these at all until a particular point, and they did need them. The flip side of this is that as you get to 50, 60 people, somebody's going to say, well, I want to be a tech lead. I want this on my resume. I want this in my game credit. I want this. And so they're going to start using this title, whether or not you approve it or not, and you have to figure out how you're going to manage that going forward. So it's always going to be morphing depending on the size of the organization. So be ready for that change. And see how you want to direct it, because what works at 10 to 30 people is not going to work for 300. So you know things are going to have to change, but the best thing you can do is talk to the people that are involved in that change to figure out what actually makes sense for everybody all around.
Sorry if I could just monopolize your time. Let's go follow-up question on that. One of the things I've been fascinated is the idea of in larger structures making smaller groups, like looking at your military. A platoon is 12 people for a reason. Like there's a reason why sports.
32.
32.
Canada,
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
A squad, well, whatever it is. Anyway, never mind. The smaller teams, there's a reason why small teams are functional. When everyone has their back. Do you believe in when you're growing in maintaining small individual teams, or do you have people working in large teams?
I do. One thing that the military does really well is that organizational structure. But the modern militaries today picked it up from the Romans 3,000 years ago. So the first unit is the individual, the second unit is the team of two, the next unit is the squad or section, the next unit after that is the platoon, the next unit after that is two platoons making a company, two or more companies making a battalion/brigade, however you want to slice all that up. I strongly recommend that kind of approach where people know the person that they're working with, right? And they end up having that very strong cohesion in that group of 8 to 10. Like some of the strongest morale and sense of esprit de corps and belonging we have is in the smaller teams that we have of 2 to 10 people. You start getting to that 10 to 15 people don't know each other as well, right? We have one team in the 45 mark right now, and they don't have the same level of cohesion that some of our smaller teams do, but the subgroups of 5 to 10 people in there really do. So I'm a strong advocate and believer in using that exact type of structure. It's very difficult to impose that, though. That has to be promoted from a perspective of a manager of like, this is a good way to do things, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And then the team, just like Agile, right? Agile is self-directing, and so let the team go and figure out what the best way is for these things to come together. Anybody else? Hands? No?
I've got one non-rehearsed question for you. You've talked about your path in terms of this scaling presentation. Yep. Can you talk about if you had to do things differently, what have you learned? What would you change in your path to where you are now?
My professional path here?
Professional or personal?
I would have finished high school. Then I probably would have finished university. Personally, for sure, the lack of education was very harmful in a lot of ways because it was having to work 3 or 4 times harder, even though I knew that I had some capabilities. That was a massive chip on my shoulder. And in fact, I remember telling members of my MBA team, it's like, oh, it's going to be so good to have that chip off my shoulder gone. And at graduation, somebody just walks up and swipes it off metaphorically. So personally, for sure, lack of the educational credentials when you have the experience and the smarts does hurt in some certain circumstances until you're at a very high level of experience. And for me, from like 1994 onwards in tech, it's almost 30 years, right? So that kind of speaks for itself, at least I hope anyway, for being able to say I've seen a couple of different things. From a professional standpoint, for things that I would have done differently among all of those, is again, I take a look at the topic that I talked about today with change management. Like that, I would have learned way more about earlier in the game, because the ability to understand a change, communicate a change, and have people buy into that change the same way that I think it's important is 10 times more important than any of these like big strategic reasons as to why you have to be bold, why you have to go forward, because you can't do this alone. You have to be able to be have some level of expertise where you can be like that advocate for change as a positive force as opposed to why we're always in crisis management. why we're always trying to figure out what's broken and try to fix that, as opposed to we are going to make an anticipatory change going forward. And if I'd known a lot more about change management going into this in the last couple of years, we would have a very different story for ourselves, for sure. Great question, though. All right. Any other questions from the floor?
I think we're good.
No? All right, well, thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.